All right, welcome to another episode of The Other Side with Marchson and Spears. I am Justin Spears, and joined with me tonight is Mr. Mike Marchson, back from a weekend getaway, and had an opportunity to catch up with him yesterday and kind of filled him in on what I was able to go over on Monday in terms of the podcast. And so he and I had a conversation and kind of spurred almost on the moment, an idea that he and I were kind of related back to the concepts of healthcare and net neutrality, and then just kind of taking it out and expanding it out from there in general to other governmental policies. And so we were wanting to talk a little bit tonight about messaging with the tax cut plan that came through yesterday as well. I was telling him in casual conversation too that I'm seeing a lot from the Democrats in terms of what their messaging is about this, and so that he kind of weighed in on some other things. And so we just decided, hey, let's turn this into a full blown episode. We think that there's enough in here to be able to do that, and so we think this is a really important thing. So as I was telling you guys on Monday, I was talking about net neutrality and healthcare from an economic perspective, right? I was talking to you about factors of production and the risk that individuals businesses take when they enter into the market. And so there certainly are implications there that are worthy to discuss and talk about and think about. But then there's also these issues related to the messaging and what you as a consumer in the market, as a citizen in your community and in this state and country, are going to form opinions and thoughts about in relation to these things. And most people have a pool of resources, we'll call it, that they will gather information from, that certainly we know is changing a lot here over the last 10 to 15 years, the manner in which people get their information, their messaging, and maybe stopping and thinking a little bit about, gosh, what do I think about that? Do I just blindly buy into what these guys are saying, and why do I believe what this representative says, or what this news station says, or what this blogger says, or all of those different things. So we wanted to talk a little bit about that and the overall message of really kind of, for lack of a better term, picking a little bit on the left here in some of their strategy that they've used over time to control the messaging. And so that's where I want to kind of throw it over to you, Mike. So welcome in this evening. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. It's been a tactic of the left to control the message, not just in recent times, but this has been a tactic for almost 100 years. And you can date this back to the progressive era of the early 20th century with Woodrow Wilson and some of the other progressive politicians that were influential back then. But yeah, when you were discussing net neutrality, I thought you did a great job talking about the economic implications. And I especially like the point you made about the fact that the internet is not something that you can just go and get in nature, right? It's got to be put together. I mean, this service is something that has to be put together with factors of production and factors of production costs. So the idea that people just have this free right to it doesn't make any sense, because somebody else has to put in their land, labor, and capital there. But yeah, as we were discussing, there are also political implications when we talk about government control or government kind of their foot in the door to the internet. And those political implications, I think, have to do with their desire to control the message to the American public. And when I say that this strategy goes back a while, when they first start, look, this is actually a fairly wise strategy if you want to talk about how you're getting information from point A to point B. But the left in this country took two institutions and they really, really hammered out a plan to infiltrate these institutions. And those institutions were academia and media, right? And what the left did was, in order to control the message, they hit hard. They made sure that they got themselves into academia and media. And if we just look at academia today, what is the composition of university faculty? I mean, it's going to be, would you say it's a stretch to say 90% leftist, 90% liberal?
Oh no, I think that's probably a pretty accurate number to throw out there. And even universities and colleges that were at one time considered "quote unquote" conservative have
Sure.
even developed a liberal bent to them.
Yeah, and that's on the academic side. And then if you look at who even represents teachers in K-12, the teachers unions, there are statistics because they have to, disclose who they give to. 99% of their donations go to Democrats and leftist causes. So that's the academia portion. And the media portion, I mean, you've heard the term liberal media. It's not just something that's made up by right wingers, but the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times. These are all leftists or at least left-leaning media, and CBS, ABC, NBC. Early on, these were the only forms of media that people really had access to. If you wanted to get information, you had two options. It was either through academia or through the Washington Post, New York Times, CBS, NBC, or ABC, and that was it. And so they did a really good job of controlling the message from that perspective. However, it started to fall apart, as time went on. And I have to ask you, do you remember the Fairness Doctrine?
Yeah, I vaguely recall that back in my business days, when I was in sales, I listened to a lot of talk radio in the car during the day, and on the AM side, you basically, your lineup was, and I would listen to, maybe a sports talk show here and there, but you had your local guy from 6 to 9, and then I believe you had Beck on from 9 to noon, and then you had Limbaugh from noon to 3, and then Hannity from 3 to 6. So I caught a lot of what they kind of described and talked about in terms of the Fairness Doctrine, in terms of what it meant to them in talk radio. But I don't know a whole lot about the actual policy or act itself.
Well, yeah. Anyway, the reason I bring that up is because when I first heard net neutrality, and look, I'll be honest with you, you could have asked me about net neutrality 2 weeks ago, I would have no idea what you're talking about. And like I would say, that's probably true for 99% of the country, whether or not they want to admit it. This is something that has just boom, hit society. And it was all over the news, especially last week. And I didn't pay any attention to it prior to that, and I didn't even know what it was. But when I first, and like everybody else, I'm trying to catch up on it, read and figure out what the heck everybody's having this meltdown about. When I first heard the term net neutrality, first thing I thought of was the Fairness Doctrine. And for those who don't know, the Fairness Doctrine, this was an old FCC regulation, old like post-World War II, like 1940s. And basically what the doctrine said was that if you were a broadcast channel, and there weren't that many of them, again, if we're talking about the 40s, we're talking you have a couple of options on radio, maybe a couple on TV is just in its infancy. I don't even know what the options were on TV. But the Fairness Doctrine stated that if you were to present any news, you had to talk about items that were of vital national interest to the public, and then B, give equal time to opposing views. So you had to talk about it in a, you couldn't give one position, 100% of the time and then leave out another position. Now, on its face, obviously that's a ridiculous rule, but that's not here. That's not what we're going to discuss. But that's what the Fairness Doctrine was, and that's when it came into play in the 1940s, and those were the reasons. But obviously, as the decades went on, it made less and less sense as there were more broadcast channels available, not only on radio but on television. There was really the rule amounted to nothing more than a violation of First Amendment right to free speech. So it was the Reagan administration that pulled the plug on this thing. The FCC voted 4-0 to cut the Fairness Doctrine, and it went away. That was in 1987. And since that time, the left in this country has been trying to reinstate it. And if you look at the fact that they pulled the plug on it in 1987, the Rush Limbaugh show started in 1988, the next year, and he immediately became the most popular radio figure in radio history. I mean, there are more listeners to his show every single day for the last, almost 30 years now than anybody else in history. It's remarkable. And if you are operating from a position of we need to control the message, you can see how painful it is to watch somebody like Rush Limbaugh. But it's not just him who dominated talk radio, right? Like you were talking, Glenn Beck, Sean Hannity. These are all wildly popular radio hosts. And so there became this third outlet for the message that the left didn't originally intend on. And so when Reagan repealed the Fairness Doctrine, I mean, look, anybody who's listening, if you don't know what it is or if you don't believe me, just Google Fairness Doctrine. That, you know, and you can look up on there which political party has been trying to reinstate it since it's been pulled in 1987, and it's Democrat after Democrat after Democrat after Democrat, and only Democrats and not a single Republican who have tried to put this thing back into place because it's ruining their monopoly on the message. So that happened in the 80s, and then it started to fall apart even further for the left. When you get into 1996, what comes along? Fox News. And so now, I mean, prior to that, if you wanted to watch TV and get your news, you had ABC, NBC, CBS, all very liberal. You had cable news. CNN was relatively new. We all know what CNN is. But then Fox News comes along, right? And so now people can get their information through cable, not through, you know, traditional bunny ears antennas. Fox News, and what happens there? It becomes immediately the #1 news channel. It took a while for it to overtake CNN, but it's been that way for a while now. But even like the O'Reilly factor, he immediately became the #1 news personality in cable news. I mean, he's been dominating everybody else. He's not on Fox News anymore. But it just goes to show that people were thirsting for another outlet to get that message. We saw it in talk radio. We saw it in Fox News. And then the internet, you know, after that, as we get into now like the late 90s and the 2000s, the internet really became the great equalizer. This is when the plan completely crumbled for the left. You and I can sit here and we can talk fairly libertarian, fairly conservative viewpoints, and we can broadcast them to anybody who wants to. I don't know if anybody is, but anybody who wants to listen. This really is the great equalizer, and there is no way with the internet available to anybody like you and me that the left can control the message. And when I hear this term net neutrality, and the government trying to stick their foot in the door of the internet, that was the #1 thing that I thought about. Well, hey, look, this is what this is. They're trying to manage first what, you know, content providers can charge, and or ISPs can charge different content providers, and that's just management. And after it gets to that, then they'll start managing content, and that's the big problem that I saw with net neutrality. And I thought the Trump administration did a great job of pulling the plug on this thing. It had to go. Sorry, I went a little.
Yeah, no, those are all fantastic points that you make there. And as I was kind of taking that in, as you were recounting that, you know, the thing that I find fascinating about this is, as you mentioned, losing control of the messaging. And what I really have noticed about that is the vitriol has stepped up in terms of the attacks on Republican, Libertarian, whatever, you know, whoever the target is on the topic and the issue. You know, it's fascinating to see a move away, because if you watch any left-leaning show, whether it's, you know, like Maddow or anything on CNN, Olbermann, even like the nightly news guys, right? Like Fallon and all those guys, Kimmel and stuff. Well, not all of it really. None of it's substance based. Oh, no. You're not going to really get any policy or substance or theory or anything of that nature. It's all driven by emotion. All of it is. And you can hear it in the messaging. You can read it in the blogs, the tweets, the Facebook posts. It's all just a complete meltdown emotionally over them losing, I think, as you were adequately pointing out there, the channels and people that can go to these alternative sources. You know, I even know that you and I had mentioned when they've tried to push back on the you know, the stranglehold that the Republicans had or that conservatives had on the messaging from AM radio and talk shows, and they tried to institute this Air America thing, and it was a complete and utter disaster. Nobody listened to
Even
it.
On still?
No, I don't think it is. And I know that guy like Ed Schultz, who used to have a show on, I think, MSNBC or something.
Yeah.
basically like nobody's watching this thing, and the
Listen.
channel had, I mean, and it's so funny too when they have to come to grips with economics, because what do you start losing? You don't get revenue because nobody wants to invest in running an ad during your show because nobody's watching, and then they're left with no choice but to pull the plug on this thing. And so, yeah, it's interesting to kind of see that. I wanted to kind of go back though, talked about earlier, and that is, what do you see as the overall impact, talking about academia? What do you see? You and I are both, have been in education now for about 11, 12 years. And so what do you see as the overall impact that this is having, as we think about the citizens that we are producing in our country, whether it be from elementary, middle, high school, post-secondary?
Well, I think there's, I don't like to use the word indoctrination because it seems so, um, uh, calculated and nefarious, and I don't know if I would call it that, but it is. Students are definitely, they struggle with seeing things another way or thinking outside the box. I mean, there is a there is a standard narrative that they're used to, and they really have struggled. If you present, hey, here's another way to look at this. I think you and I have described it as, I feel like I'm chipping away at a concrete wall with, a tiny little nail. I got a tiny hammer and a tiny nail, and it's just like I'm not getting anywhere. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the other thing too, that we have kind of had some conversations in passing about, and this is something that I was reflecting on earlier today, is I really think what we're creating is we're creating students and citizens. Ultimately, that's the end goal, right? Is that these are going to be young men and women who, once they leave a high school setting, some may go off to a traditional 4-year school, some may go to a 2-year associate thing, co-op, they may go right into the workforce. The ways in which they think about these issues and tackle them and take them on. And I know I try to communicate this to my students in government and econ all the time is, look, you've lived your life to the point where you've been told, here's what to think, or here are a series of facts or statements about the way things are. And as you were kind of adequately pointing out there, now all of a sudden it's, hey, let's think about this. And I really like what you were talking about there, where you were mentioning, the ability to look at it from a different perspective, or to be able to see things, from a different light. That's just something that they really, really struggle with. And I think that's kind of symptomatic of the system when it's controlled the way that it has been controlled.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And it's students have difficulty with that, thinking outside of the box. And, they tend to almost absorb the first thing that they hear. It's kind of it's like a law of firsts, and I think we're getting to them second.
Mm-hmm.
Like when we get them, they're seniors in high school, and you're talking government, and I'm talking economics, and that wall seems like it's already there, and it's already pretty thick. And there are some students who are receptive, and but even ones who identify as, I guess, would kind of identify as right-leaning, they don't really understand what they're talking about. They're still mainstream. They just have, what they see as a controversial viewpoint is something, maybe, I don't know. Maybe.
Well, I think it's difficult for them to be able to either verbalize or even in written form tell you why they believe what they believe.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I think what I was kind of trying to get at is, they might say, my tax rate should be 27% rather than 31%. I'm a conservative, and rather than, look, what taxation is complete theft. There shouldn't be any at all. You know what I mean? That's where they really have trouble. Or, they're kind of as, of course, we need government. You got to have government. I'm a conservative. I just want a little. I want them to intrude in every aspect of my life. Just tread a little bit lighter, rather than, what are you talking? Well, what do we need a government for? I mean, people can manage their own affairs. So why do you need an overlord telling you what to do? So that is where they really kind of struggle. And I kind of noticed that the door closes when, when I touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, so to kind of move toward wrapping it up a little bit here, let's come back to the idea of, the liberal mindset and ideology wanting to control the messaging through, and now you can even add in social media, but the traditional media and academia with that. I think that's one thing that we haven't really adequately discussed yet. I mean, it's one thing to acknowledge it and talk about the methods that they're using to do that. But what do you see, and maybe it's kind of like a duh statement, but what do you see as the end goal with this? What do you see as liberal, utopia or end goals with controlling this messaging?
You know what? I honestly don't have an answer for you. I don't like it, and I'm not just saying that like I don't know what they're thinking, kind of flippantly. I really don't know what the end goal is. I mean, I suppose that it's just, I can't tell if it's a desire for power and to try and kind of dumb everybody down and then ultimately take power. But then I don't know what you would do with that. Then what? Or if it is naivety to where they believe that this utopia really exists and government really can kind of move people around like chess pieces. And if they manage and move them properly, then we can have this perfect utopia society, and all of the ills of society can be alleviated. I just don't know which one it is, to be honest with you. I assume it's one of the two, but I couldn't tell you which one.
Yeah, that's gosh. Here's the thing that I struggle with, and I guess I don't have enough conversations with others. I try to listen to and read some of what comes out of the left every now and then, just kind of get their perspective and everything. But here's what I always struggle with. And if there's somebody out there listening that is of a left-leaning ideology, please feel free to shoot us a message or leave a comment or something, because I would love to know. So the general message that I usually get from the left is that man kind of sucks. We're evil. If left to our own devices, we're going to screw everybody over. And so that's why we need government, right? We need government to level the playing field, regulations for policing, for just about anything that, would be a statist mindset as to why the government needs to be a part of our lives. But those same people that are, quote unquote, evil or out to get you are the same people running the government, right? I mean, that's the thing that I've always it's like corporate greed. Like government doesn't have greed. It's like corporate, screw jobs. Like government's not going to screw you over. That these companies are just going to do all these evil things to you, and that you need the government to regulate and level the playing field for the average Joe. But then there's just it's like, was it Madison that said if men were angels, then no government would be needed, or something along those lines? Right. But it's not like these guys are the cream of the crop. I mean, we see corruption, we see the sex abuse scandals, we see all kinds of different evils within our government. So I just don't get how you can logically get to the step where it's like, well, yeah, I want to give up more of my freedom and liberty to that.
Give it to them. Yeah, I know. We hear this stuff coming out, and you're right. Like, Menendez from New Jersey, there's this bribery and corruption case going on. Of course, we've heard everything with Al Franken and Roy Moore, and these are the guys that you want to just dish over more power and more of your hard-earned money to. I don't get it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think what's happened is, again, kind of to tie it up here, my final thoughts on it at least are, you went back and talked, and I'm so glad that you went back, in the history and didn't just make it a modern day topic like, oh, this just all of a sudden happened, because this has been something. I mean, if you want to go all the way back to the beginning, right? I mean, at the Constitutional Convention, the Anti-Federalists were screaming about what this new central government that the Federalists wanted to create was going to look like. And boy, if you read some speeches from Franklin and everything, I mean, he's almost prophetic in what he says about the government. But the whole idea that the government has slowly encroached. And I really think that the tipping point in all of this, and where conservatives have kind of been running uphill ever since, is the Great Depression and what Roosevelt was able to do in terms of getting the American to buy into the mindset that, golly, if the government wasn't here, and you see that in the messaging of how people receive Hoover. He was the do-nothing president. You've refuted that several times and talked about how that was a fallacy, but that was the messaging, right?
Right.
That's been, yeah, and so it's this idea that, gosh, if Roosevelt wouldn't have built in all the alphabet soup agencies, and if he wouldn't have paid government workers more and forced the hand of business to have to pay more, you'd still be earning 30 cents an hour, working 90 hours a week with no paid time off. And, we have the government to thank for all that, as if the market wouldn't have been able to handle that itself.
That's exactly right. And look, and you can say the exact same thing about modern day. Look what's going on today. Who is the hero? Obamacare. It saved all these people were dying. They were on the verge of death. We signed in Obamacare, and all of a sudden, healthcare is fixed. And now, what do the Republicans want to do? I read an article on MSNBC today. It was an NBC News article, but it was highlighted on MSNBC. And yeah, I do go and I read because I want to see what the lunatics on the other side are saying. But it was 2 million children will be kicked off of CHIP, and somehow related to the tax bill. And it's so dishonest to the point where it's just an outright lie. The tax bill and CHIP, they are not related. It's what Jimmy Kimmel said, in his crying speech that he gave last week. The tax bill and CHIP are two separate. You didn't have to do one and give up the other. They weren't linked like that. In fact, the Republicans, it's a bipartisan support for CHIP. The Republicans already offered to authorize it, and the Democrats are the ones who vetoed it because they didn't like the funding mechanism. So this idea that because of the tax bill, and for those who don't know, it's the Children's Health Insurance Program, because of the tax bill that CHIP is not going to get funded, it's just an outright lie. But that's the message. It's the same as Roosevelt and the alphabet soup and the fact that Hoover was a do-nothing president. This is what people believe.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely accurate. And yeah, I thought it was kind of funny too, because one of the leading Democrats that I've heard railing on this tax cut story is none other than Nancy Pelosi. And I guess today she was giving a press conference and was quoted as essentially saying it's a Frankenstein. And anybody who's familiar with Frankenstein knows it was a creation, a monster that was created. Do you know the ending of the story, Mary Shelley's story? She says the monster comes back to destroy. To which I had tweeted back, this is spot on analysis of the creation of the federal government. Well done, Congresswoman, because she's accurately describing what the federal government is as a monster. And it just continues to encroach into everyday parts of our lives. And yeah, absolutely, when they are able to look at trying to control the messaging and get those types of things out there, that there were, I heard her say on the floor of the House, she's just railing on Republicans about, I hope on your victory lap you don't trip over the wheelchairs of the disabled that are going to die as a result of this tax cut. And just, the rhetoric and just the, outright just, it's not even hypocrisy or, anything of that nature. It's just evil. It's just saying those types of things as though Republicans are wanting to see people die. And then you see guys like from the Huffington Post that, I don't know if you saw this or not, tweeted out today or said in one of his blog posts that, he hoped that essentially that McConnell and Ryan and everything, the whole obit thing and everything. It's like, if a Republican said that, if a conservative said that, they would be out of a job in a heartbeat. They would be lambasted nonstop by the left. And yet, the guy gets a free pass on it because, he's well-intentioned and well-meaning and has a big heart, I guess, but Republicans don't. So I don't know. It's like I said, it's almost like you're fighting an uphill battle. And look, those that have listened to us, and we mentioned this before, we are not in the tank Republicans. For myself, and I know that you kind of lean this way a little bit too, we would identify more as libertarians. So I'm not giving Republicans a free pass on some of the idiocy and idiotic statements that they put out because they've had their fair share. But there's no denying the fact that the left has had a stranglehold on the messaging and the ideology that they have tried to spread through this country to great success. And I think you said it right. Look, it was smart. It was a smart play to get into those two methods or those two channels of communication. And we've seen, essentially then the battle that has ensued since then. And with the advent of, like you said, talk radio and now social media has kind of leveled the playing field a little bit. And it'll be interesting to see what things look like moving forward.
Yeah, it is. And then just to wrap up, it's not a surprise that they would try and make the internet a public utility. It's not a surprise at all.
So, with both net neutrality and the tax bill and Obamacare and all these big issues, as the government is moving on these things, the only thing that I can say at this point, all I can actually say is I don't know what the end result is going to be. Nobody does, unless you've got a crystal ball that can show you this. What I can tell you is what the immediate reaction have been, and man, has there been an outpouring from the corporate world of, hey, this is what we're signaling based off of what we see. And it appears to be good news. I saw a story this morning from the Business Insider, which is usually one of the more liberal leaning papers, that said, essentially that the economy grew at a healthy 3.2%. I know in my town, I see help wanted signs popping up in small businesses across town, and even some of the bigger retail outlet places and stuff as well. So I think there's a clear indication here that initially, at least, the signals are this is going to work. I know that the nasty lingo of trickle down is something that the left, that's a curse word in the left's vocabulary, but it essentially looks like that could be the beginnings of what that might look like, and we'll see what happens from here.
Yeah, and you know what? Just let people judge for themselves. If everybody starts dying in the street, you and I will be the first ones to admit we were wrong, but I don't think that's going to happen. Absolutely.
Well, it was good to get on tonight and go over this. I certainly enjoyed this as a follow-up. I think it is an important aspect for people, ultimately think about these things, guys, as you take these issues one by one and wrestle with them. First, do that. Please think about them. Don't just buy in on either side of the aisle to the emotional pleas and arguments that you're hearing being made, primarily from the left. But, if you hear somebody from the right doing this as well, take the time to research it, to think it through. And, that's essentially what we try to do with all of our topics on here, is to provoke you to think about things and research them a little bit more. And so hopefully this podcast has helped accomplish that goal. So, Mike, thanks for taking time to go through this tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for listening tonight, guys. And as we always say, you have now heard the other side.